When I first moved to Sagewood Acres, a suburban enclave just north of Houston, I thought it was a quiet haven. My new house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, flanked by two-story homes that all looked remarkably similar: tin stucco walls, neatly trimmed lawns, and identical mailboxes with wrought iron stands. During my initial walkthrough, I'd admired the wide sidewalks, the leafy magnolia trees, and the cheerful neighbors jogging with dogs or pushing strollers. It felt like an idyllic environment in which to settle down and grow the vegetable garden I'd always dreamed of. I bought the place with high hopes, but my illusions of carefree living took a hit the moment I received the thick HOA, Homeowners Association, packet. The Sagewood Acres bylaws were exhaustive, covering everything from mailbox heights to the style of porch lights. I skimmed them, slightly alarmed, but told myself that strict rules could help maintain order and property values. On my moving day, a handful of neighbors offered quick waves from their driveways. Only one person made a beeline for me. A woman in her early 50s, with a sharp bob haircut and a pastel blouse, hurried up with a clipboard in hand. She had an air of confidence that bordered on aggression, like a self-appointed supervisor checking on a construction site. "I'm Helene Mansfield," she said briskly, "but everyone around here calls me Karen. I'm on the HOA board. Welcome to the neighborhood." Her smile was thin. Before I could reply, she peered over my shoulder at the moving truck. "Make sure your movers don't block the fire hydrant," she added, "or I'll have to file a complaint. We're quite strict about access here at Sagewood Acres." I assured her we'd be careful. She nodded, scribbled something on her clipboard, and marched away without another word. Two older neighbors standing nearby rolled their eyes the moment she disappeared. Later that day, one of them, Mr. Donahue, a friendly retiree, offered me a hushed warning: "Watch out for Karen. She's the real power behind this HOA. She'll find any excuse to come after you if you're not careful." Initially, I shrugged it off. After all, how bad could it be? In the weeks that followed, however, I started hearing more ominous stories. Karen had previously forced one family to tear out a kid's playhouse in their backyard because it violated architectural uniformity. She demanded that a neighbor remove a Happy Thanksgiving wreath 2 days after the holiday. Rumor had it she personally patrolled the streets with a tape measure to ensure trash cans weren't left on the curb too long. At first, these anecdotes seemed exaggerated, but the more people I spoke to, the more I realized they were true. The real trouble began when Karen discovered I was planting an organic vegetable garden in my backyard. I'd spent years learning about permaculture, composting, and natural pest control. I wanted to grow heirloom tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and herbs, enough to feed myself and share with friends. For me, it was more than a hobby. It was a passion project that symbolized self-sufficiency and healthy living. My first inkling of trouble came when the local landscaper I hired mentioned that Karen had dropped by, asking pointed questions about property use. He warned me that she wasn't a fan of unconventional landscaping, citing an instance where she'd forced a neighbor to remove a patch of wildflowers because they looked weedy. Even so, I had the HOA's landscaping guidelines on my side. They didn't prohibit vegetable gardens as long as they remained neat and well-maintained. By the end of summer, I'd prepped raised beds with rich compost, carefully arranged a drip irrigation system, and built a small greenhouse. I was proud of how things were shaping up. Whenever I spoke with neighbors, they sounded supportive, even excited. But from across the street, Karen kept throwing me suspicious glances, as if my simple plan to grow tomatoes in a suburban backyard was an affront to her sense of order. Fall arrived, and my garden project was in full swing. I'd planted an array of seedlings in starter trays, heirloom tomatoes, peppers, and some leafy greens. This being Texas, autumn remained warm enough for an extended growing season. My backyard shimmered with possibilities. Then, one Saturday morning, Karen knocked on my door. She wore a pastel yellow cardigan, and her expression teetered between forced politeness and undisguised annoyance. "Good morning," she greeted me in a clipped tone. "I understand you have a vegetable garden in progress." I smiled. "Yes, I do. Just starting out, but I'm excited." She pursed her lips. "We've had complaints about possible vermin issues related to such gardens in other developments. Are you sure you're following proper hygiene standards?" "Hygiene standards for a vegetable garden?" I blinked. "I keep everything tidy. The compost bin is sealed. I remove any fallen produce. I use natural pest controls, so there's no rotting food or anything that might attract rodents." Karen's eyes swept over my shoulder. "Mind if I take a quick look in your backyard? Just to ensure it meets HOA standards." My immediate impulse was to refuse. There was no specific bylaw that allowed random board members to inspect private property for hygiene. Still, I didn't want to escalate tensions. Perhaps if I humored her, she'd realize I was doing nothing wrong and leave me alone. So, with reluctance, I said, "All right, but only this once." She stepped into my yard, circled my raised beds, and examined the compost bin. She looked unimpressed, but I wasn't worried. I'd kept the area tidy. After a minute or two, she turned to me with a tight smile. "It's acceptable for now," she said. "But be aware, the HO might need to conduct periodic checks. We don't want your garden creating a nuisance." I bit back a retort, reminding myself to stay polite. My garden isn't harming anyone, and the HOA guidelines do allow for home vegetable plots, provided they're neat. I've read the rules thoroughly. She narrowed her eyes. "I'm sure you have. Let's just hope we don't see any issues." With that, she left in a swirl of pastel yellow. A mixture of anger and anxiety churned in my gut. The woman's nerve was astounding. Over the next weeks, neighbors reported seeing Karen lingering at the edge of my property, as if scrutinizing my greenhouse through binoculars. Mr. Donahue joked that she might climb the fence for a closer look. I only half laughed, uneasy about how far her meddling could go. Yet, for a while, nothing happened. My seedlings took root, my compost thrived, and I began to taste the fruits of my labor in small harvests of lettuce, basil, and cherry tomatoes. Life at Sagewood Acres seemed calm enough, as long as I pretended not to notice Karen lurking around. Then, at the monthly HOA meeting, she unveiled a new proposal, guidelines for household agriculture. She claimed it was necessary to protect the neighborhood from unsanitary conditions that could arise from personal gardens. Several of us argued that the existing rules were sufficient. There was no outbreak of pests or foul smells. But Karen insisted. Although the board didn't immediately pass her proposal, they agreed to study the issue, giving her an opening to keep pushing for more oversight. I sensed the storm clouds gathering. As winter crept in, the temperature dropped slightly, but my greenhouse allowed me to keep some veggies going: kale, spinach, and a few pepper plants that thrived in mild Texan winters. I also started a new batch of tomato seedlings under grow lights. Meanwhile, rumors circulated that Karen was pressing for more power to inspect properties suspected of health code violations. One afternoon, while I was bending over a row of spinach, a soft voice startled me. "Hey there." I turned to see Georgia, a neighbor from 2 streets over. I recognized her from a block party. She had short, curly hair and an earnest demeanor. She glanced around as if afraid of being overheard. "Listen," she whispered. "I heard Karen talking about your garden at the last board session. She was making all kinds of insinuations, said your compost might be breeding bacteria, and your greenhouse could be a vector for mold." My jaw tightened. That's outrageous. I maintain everything properly. She's just looking for reasons to shut me down. Georgia nodded. "I know, but be careful. She's got the ear of certain board members who believe her alarmist stories. And if they vote in new rules requiring random health inspections, you could end up in a bureaucratic nightmare." Heart-pounding, I thanked Georgia for the tip. In my mind, the whole idea was absurd. My backyard wasn't a commercial farm. But I remembered how Karen thrived on inventing concerns to justify her meddling. I decided to document everything. I photographed my greenhouse, my compost bin, my raised beds, each labeled with the date, showing how clean and organized they were. I saved receipts for organic fertilizers and pest controls. If Karen tried to accuse me of negligence, I'd have evidence. Still, my anxiety grew. I'd wake up at night imagining Karen poking around outside. Sometimes, I'd hear faint footsteps and rush to the window, only to see nothing but moonlit grass. Was I being paranoid, or was she truly snooping around? In a bold move, I mentioned my concerns to Mark, another HOA board member who seemed more reasonable than Karen. He advised me to install motion sensor lights and cameras, just in case. Mark claimed he didn't fully trust Karen's methods, especially after she'd orchestrated fines for minuscule infractions in the past. He hinted that if I could catch her overstepping, I'd have grounds to file a formal complaint. That evening, I shopped online for a simple night vision camera, one that could record any activity in my backyard. I didn't want to become a neighborhood spy, but I refused to let Karen twist the narrative if she ever trespassed again. As the holiday season approached, most residents decorated their homes with fairy lights, wreaths, and inflatables. My place was no exception. I strung up twinkling lights and set a reindeer figure by the front door. The entire neighborhood glowed festively, turning crisp winter evenings into a cheerful panorama. But under that blanket of holiday spirit, My tension with Karen kept simmering. She left a note in my mailbox, official-looking, typed on HOA letterhead, reminding me that any holiday displays in backyard areas must be consistent with community guidelines. My backyard holiday decor was minimal at best, just a small strand of lights around the greenhouse, but she found an excuse to mention it anyway. At the next HOA meeting, Karen proposed a garden sanitation committee, claiming it would help neighbors maintain safe, hygienic conditions. Half the residents rolled their eyes at the suggestion, while the other half seemed indifferent or unsure. My friend Georgia stood up and asked pointedly, "What evidence do we have that someone's garden is unsanitary?" Karen sidestepped the question, spewing vague claims about potential rodent infestation and compost odor. She never explicitly named me, but everyone knew her remarks were aimed in my direction. After the meeting, Mark pulled me aside. "Don't worry too much," he said. "She lacks the votes to form such a committee right now. But if she stirs up enough panic, she might get her way eventually." I nodded. "I just want to be left alone. It's my private property." He shrugged sympathetically. "That's not how Karen sees it. She's convinced her role is to police every aspect of this neighborhood." While the HOA politics simmered, I focused on my garden. In December, my greenhouse tomatoes began to flower. Tiny peppers formed on dwarf plants. My kale grew lush in raised beds. The sight of healthy produce under winter skies filled me with pride. I shared some spinach and herbs with Mr. Donahue, who marveled at how I'd managed such a neat operation. Occasionally, I spotted Karen pacing on the sidewalk across from my house, eyeing my backyard as if searching for infractions with laser precision. Each time, I reminded myself that I was fully in compliance. Yet, her unwavering scrutiny weighed on me. After the new year, I noticed footprints in the dirt by my fence, small impressions, possibly from a woman's shoe, leading around the side of my greenhouse. I felt a chill, recalling the times I'd imagined someone creeping outside at night. My camera was installed, yes, but maybe its angle needed adjusting. That very evening, I shifted its position to cover a larger swath of the yard, especially near the greenhouse and raised beds. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was biding her time, searching for the perfect moment to declare me a menace. What I didn't realize was that her next move would be far more direct and destructive than idle talk at an HOA meeting. By late January, my vegetable garden was flourishing. I'd managed to harvest small batches of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs from the greenhouse. Outside, I had onions and kale thriving in raised beds, plus a neat row of winter lettuce. Neighbors occasionally teased me about my mini farm, but many also praised the fresh produce I shared. One chilly evening, I locked up the greenhouse around 9 p.m., then retreated indoors to enjoy a cup of tea. A friend called around 10, and we chatted for a half hour about unrelated topics. By 11, I headed upstairs to read, lulled by the hum of the heater and the comfortable quiet of the suburban night. Shortly after midnight, I stirred from half-sleep, sensing something amiss. No obvious noises filtered in, but my gut told me to check the backyard camera feed on my phone, just in case. I tapped the security app. The screen remained blank. Confused, I realized I hadn't received any motion alerts. Maybe I was being paranoid. Sometime later, maybe 1 a.m., my phone vibrated with a motion notification. My heart pounded as I unlocked the phone. The real-time feed showed a shape moving in the dark. A figure crept along the perimeter of my greenhouse, wearing what looked like a hood or a beanie. Light from the camera's infrared mode cast eerie shadows. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was definitely in my yard, rummaging around near the raised beds. As I watched in disbelief, the figure began poking through my tomato seedlings. The faint glow of a flashlight flickered across the rows, and I saw what looked like a woman's silhouette. Could it be Karen? My mind raced. Should I rush outside and confront her, or call the police? But before I could decide, the intruder started yanking plants from the dirt, tossing them aside. My heart lurched. Why on earth was she destroying my seedlings? This was beyond any rational motive. Panic flooded me, yet a part of me remembered. I have this on video. I scrambled out of bed, half ready to burst into the yard, but then realized it might be safer to keep recording and gather undeniable proof. For the next few minutes, the person trampled seedlings, knocked over trays, and dug into my tomato patch with what looked like a small spade. At one point, they kicked over an entire seed tray, scattering sprouts. I had to clap a hand over my mouth to stop myself from shouting. Then, as abruptly as it began, the figure turned and strode off camera toward the fence. My phone screen returned to the default view. The intruder had vanished into the night. My pulse hammered in my ears. I replayed the recorded footage in disbelief, capturing each damning moment. Although the figure wore a hood, there were fleeting angles where the face was somewhat visible in the faint IR illumination. It looked enough like Karen's build and posture to convince me. She'd apparently decided my garden was unhygienic and taken it upon herself to fix it by destroying it. The audacity left me stunned. After calming myself, I realized it would be safer to wait until morning to inspect the damage. I armed my security system, locked every window, and tried to sleep. But rest remained elusive. Rage, hurt, and confusion warred within me. At dawn, I rushed outside to see the extent of the destruction. My heart sank at the sight. Dozens of seedlings lay crushed or uprooted. A few pepper plants had been snapped at the stems. The seed trays near the greenhouse door were overturned, the fragile sprouts wilted beyond saving. My neat row of tomato seedlings was a mess of scattered potting soil, jagged stems, and bent wire supports. I felt tears prick my eyes. Months of careful nurturing undone by a malicious act. Why? Was it revenge? Some twisted notion of protecting the community from my unhygienic garden? It seemed ludicrous, but Karen's track record showed she was capable of extreme measures if she felt justified. For a moment, heartbreak eclipsed my anger. Then, I remembered the camera footage. This time, it was more than just suspicion. I had concrete proof of trespassing and vandalism. My sadness hardened into determination. I snapped dozens of photos to document the damage, then rushed inside to download the night vision clips. I paused to scrutinize every frame where the intruder's face tilted toward the camera. Although somewhat blurred, the shape of her jaw and the slope of her nose strongly resembled Karen's features. The hoodie or beanie didn't fully conceal her hair. There were glimpses of a shorter, layered cut, consistent with Karen's style. And the intruder's clothing was pastel-toned, something Karen was known for wearing even in winter. Without hesitating, I sent an urgent email to the HOA board, minus Karen. I attached select screenshots and video snippets explaining what had happened. I titled it, Formal Trespassing and Property Destruction Complaint. I also CC'd Mark and a couple of neighbors who'd witnessed Karen's meddling in the past. My message was polite but firm. Dear HOA board members, I regret to inform you of a serious incident that occurred last night on my property at address. An individual trespassed into my backyard and caused significant damage to my vegetable garden, uprooting plants and destroying seed trays. I have clear security camera footage that appears to show one of our HOA board members carrying out these actions. As this involves trespassing, vandalism, and potential violation of HOA ethics, I am requesting an immediate investigation. I will be consulting with local authorities and seeking compensation for the damage. Please see attached screenshots and video clips. I look forward to a swift resolution. Sincerely, my name. Once I hit send, my hands trembled with a mix of adrenaline and residual anger. Regardless of how the board responded, I was determined to hold Karen accountable. If they tried to protect her, I'd file a police report. A few hours later, as I was sweeping the greenhouse floor, my phone buzzed nonstop. First, an email from Eric, the HOA president, stating he was shocked and would convene an emergency board meeting. Another from Lisa, the treasurer, apologizing for the awful situation and promising her support in bringing the culprit to justice. Then a flurry of texts from neighbors. Some had seen the email thread. Others had heard rumors that Karen was behind the vandalism. Everyone was in uproar. I expected Karen might appear at my door, outraged or contrite, but she stayed silent. Perhaps she was planning to deny everything, or maybe she was panicking. The notion of her rummaging through her closet, wondering if I'd recognized her pastel hoodie, brought me grim satisfaction. That afternoon, I received an official notice that the HOA would hold a special session the next evening, specifically about my complaint. Karen was required to attend, and so was I. The email also asked me to bring any further evidence. I agreed, and decided to invite a few supportive neighbors as witnesses. The next evening, I arrived at the Sagewood Acres Community Center feeling a swirl of nerves and resolve. My laptop contained the unedited video, plus additional frames I'd enhanced for clarity. Neighbors trickled in, whispering about the drama. A buzz of anticipation filled the room. It wasn't every day the HOA convened to address alleged vandalism by one of its own. Karen sat at the far end of a long table, arms crossed, wearing a pale pink blazer. Her expression was tight, her gaze darting around but rarely settling on me. The other board members, Eric, Lisa, Mark, and two others, looked somber. Once everyone was seated, Eric cleared his throat and declared the session in order. We're here to address a formal complaint filed by my name, alleging trespassing and property destruction by a member of this HOA board, specifically Ms. Mansfield, also known colloquially as Karen. He sighed, glancing at the agenda. We'll review the evidence, allow both sides to speak, and then decide on appropriate action. I connected my laptop to a small projector, a hush falling over the audience as the night vision footage played. Gasps rippled through the room when the hooded figure uprooted seedlings, knocking trays aside. The subtle moments where Karen's facial profile aligned with the camera's view were especially damning, though somewhat grainy. Still, the pastel coat and the figure's posture caused more murmurs. A few onlookers whispered, "That's definitely Karen." Or, "How could she do that?" When the video ended, Eric looked grim. "Ms. Mansfield, how do you respond to these allegations?" Karen inhaled slowly, her voice tight. "I was home all night. This footage is inconclusive. You can't prove that's me. And even if it were," she paused, glancing around nervously, "there could be legitimate reasons to check someone's garden for hygiene issues. This entire complaint is blown out of proportion." A burst of indignation rose in me. Blown out of proportion? My property was vandalized. This wasn't an inspection, it was destruction. And no HOA bylaw allows you, or anyone else, to invade someone's yard at night and rip up plants. Karen's nostrils flared. "I've filed multiple complaints about potential health hazards from your compost and greenhouse. Perhaps I felt compelled to verify the conditions. It's possible some plants needed removal if they were contaminated." The crowd began muttering. Lisa leaned forward. "Karen, that's absurd. We have no official rule that you, acting alone, can forcibly remove a resident's plants. If there was a genuine concern, the HOA would have followed a formal process, not a clandestine nighttime rampage." Mark nodded firmly. "This goes beyond an overreach of authority. It's trespassing and property damage. We have no record of the board approving any such action." Karen sputtered, her cheeks reddening. "I'm telling you, I didn't do this. The footage is inconclusive. We all wear pastel in this community." A snort of disbelief rippled among the neighbors. I remained calm. "I have additional frames showing your face. Plus, neighbors noticed footprints around my yard consistent with your shoe size. And the same pastel jacket you often wear was glimpsed earlier that day." Eric tapped his pen. "Let's keep this orderly. Karen, do you have any alibi or evidence showing you were somewhere else that night?" She hesitated a fraction too long. I was alone at home, reading. There's no one to verify." A tense silence followed. Lisa cleared her throat. "Given the footage, the damage done, and your lack of a verifiable alibi, I propose we move to a board vote on disciplinary action. This is a serious infraction, Karen. Even if you believe the garden was unsanitary, the process you followed, if indeed it was you, is unacceptable." Karen looked like she wanted to protest, but the board pressed forward. They voted, right there, on two motions. First, to recommend a fine for trespassing and property damage, and second, to remove Karen from any enforcement duties pending a thorough investigation. Both passed overwhelmingly, with Karen the lone dissenting vote. A ripple of relief spread across the room. Eric turned to me. "Given the severity, we also encourage you to file a police report if you haven't already. Meanwhile, the HOA will require Ms. Mansfield to compensate you for the value of damaged property, contingent on final verification. We'll have an independent committee estimate the cost of your lost plants and materials." Karen slumped, her face a mix of fury and humiliation. "This is a travesty. I did everything for the good of Sagewood Acres. You'll regret this when vermin infest the neighborhood because of a neglected garden." A neighbor shot back. "The only vermin I see is your attitude, Karen." Laughter and murmurs swelled, and Karen rose abruptly, nearly toppling her chair, then stormed out of the community center. The board reconvened briefly, finalizing the official record of the session. Neighbors patted my shoulder, congratulating me on standing up to Karen. I felt a flood of relief, and a measure of sadness that it had come to this. But her destructive streak couldn't go unchallenged. Over the next week, I filed a police report with the video evidence. The officer assigned to the case seemed sympathetic, noting that while trespassing might be considered a minor offense, the combination of vandalism and property damage could lead to real consequences. In parallel, The HOA sent me official confirmation. Karen was fined for violating the association's code of conduct, and she was required to pay damages once the cost was assessed. The morning after the meeting, I walked through my garden, surveying the mess once more. My heart felt heavy. It would take time to replant, to nurse my greenhouse back to its former glory. Yet I refused to let Karen's rampage extinguish my love for gardening. If anything, her senseless act galvanized my resolve. Neighbors rallied around me, offering help. Georgia gave me spare tomato seedlings. Mr. Donahue donated some compost. Even Mark from the board offered to assist me in rebuilding the raised beds. Their kindness offset the ugliness of Karen's actions, reminding me that the spirit of community could prevail over pettiness. Within a few weeks, small green sprouts once again emerged from the soil, new life replacing what was lost. Meanwhile, Karen's hold on the HOA had weakened. Several neighbors filed separate complaints, citing her history of intrusive behavior. The board held a special election that spring to replace an outgoing member, and a more moderate, neighbor-friendly candidate won. Rumors circulated that Karen might sell her house and leave Sagewood Acres altogether. One afternoon, I spotted Karen in her driveway, loading boxes into the trunk of her pastel blue sedan. She caught my eye for a split second, scowling, before slamming the trunk and driving off. Whether she was running errands or moving out, I couldn't say. Either way, her frequent presence in the neighborhood faded dramatically. With her influence waning, Sagewood Acres breathed easier. Eventually, the independent committee calculated the cost of my losses, seedlings, potting soil, supplies, and labor. The total wasn't astronomical, but it was enough to hurt. Karen was officially instructed to pay me compensation. When the check arrived via certified mail, I felt an odd mix of vindication and sadness. It was over, at least in a legal sense. All told, the biggest victory was intangible. No longer worrying about Karen prowling around at night or calling me out at HOA meetings. I could finally cultivate my organic produce in peace. By late spring, I harvested my first batch of bright red tomatoes from the newly planted vines, an edible symbol of resilience and renewal. Sharing them with neighbors tasted even sweeter, knowing we'd collectively stood against one person's destructive meddling. To this day, I keep the night vision footage backed up on multiple devices, just in case. But mostly, I've moved on, content that justice was served. Occasionally, neighbors ask if I ever saw Karen again. I simply smile, thinking of how her hygiene check backfired. In the end, her destructive spree only highlighted the strength of community and the power of evidence. I've since expanded my garden to include a small orchard of dwarf fruit trees. My compost bin remains odor-free, my greenhouse stands proudly, and the entire backyard thrives with a sense of security. Sagewood Acres itself has become more welcoming, with a balanced HOA board that focuses on genuine neighborhood improvements rather than petty tyranny. And every time I kneel to plant a new seedling, I remember that night, when Karen barged in, overstepping all bounds of decency, and I feel a surge of satisfaction that she paid the price for her reckless invasion.